Bud Spencer disguises himself as a homeless man to test the police. What happens next is unbelievable. Before we get started, make sure to like and follow for more powerful stories that stick with you long after they end. Now let's get into it. The park was unusually quiet that afternoon. The only sounds drifting through the stillness were the light rustle of leaves moving in a lazy breeze and the distant murmur of traffic somewhere beyond the trees. Bud Spencer sat alone on a weathered blue bench near the fountain, a faded old coat hanging from his massive shoulders, the cuffs worn thin and the fabric frayed with age. A battered felt hat sat low over his brow, casting a shadow across most of his face. Beside him rested a wrinkled brown paper bag, folded over at the top. His boots, scuffed, dusty, and clearly long past their prime, stuck out beneath a pair of worn trousers. He barely moved at all when a police cruiser rolled into the lot and came to a stop, the engine idling for a second before going silent. Two officers climbed out, their boots crunching over the gravel as they looked around. One of them was young, clean-faced, and rigid in the way only a newer officer could be. His uniform was neat, sharply pressed, and his badge flashed under the afternoon light as he shifted his duty belt and glanced at his partner. The other officer was older, built heavier, somewhere in his 40s, with the kind of tired face that suggested too many years and too many shifts. Faint lines of fatigue were etched around his eyes, and there was an old coffee stain on the front of his uniform that had long since given up pretending it could be scrubbed out. "Another drifter," the younger officer muttered, jerking his chin toward Bud on the bench. "This park's turning into a shelter. Let's just see what he's doing." The older one, Officer Albert, replied in a voice touched by weariness, the kind of tone that came from seeing enough to know that appearances meant very little. "Maybe he's harmless." They walked toward him in measured steps, their presence pressing into the stillness. Bud did not flinch. He sat with his head slightly lowered, as if the two men approaching him were no more alarming than the breeze in the trees. "You can't sit here all day," Officer Martin said when they reached him, his voice clipped, hard, and unnecessarily official. "This is a public park, not your porch." Only then did Bud lift his head. Even now, the hat still concealed part of his face. He did not answer immediately. His expression revealed nothing. Instead, after a moment, he reached into the paper bag at his side. Martin stiffened instantly. His fingers brushed the baton at his waist, his shoulders tightening as if he had already decided the worst was coming. "Easy," Albert muttered, though even he didn't sound fully convinced. Bud slowly pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He unfolded it with deliberate care, then took a bite in complete silence, chewing calmly as though the officers in front of him were barely worth noticing. "Did you hear me?" Martin snapped, stepping in closer. "I said you can't just sit here all day. Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Bud swallowed and glanced up only briefly before returning his attention to the sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said in a low, even voice. "I'm eating lunch." "That's not the point," Martin shot back, irritation sharpening every word. "Guys like you make this place look bad. You drive off families. Tourists too." Albert folded his arms and watched, his patience already thinning. "What's your name?" he asked, gruffer than gentle, but without Martin's edge. Bud paused. His hand tightened around the sandwich for just a moment before he answered. "Carlo," he said. Then, after the briefest pause, "Carlo Pedersoli." Martin gave a crooked smirk. "Carlo Pedersoli, huh? Sounds important." Bud didn't respond. He just took another bite. That silence got under Martin's skin faster than any insult could have. The younger officer stepped closer and planted himself over the seated man. "Let me see some ID." Without hurrying, Bud lowered the sandwich back onto the bench. Every movement was measured, unbothered, almost irritatingly calm. He reached into the inside pocket of his battered coat and pulled out an old leather wallet, soft at the edges from years of use. He handed it over without a word. Martin flipped it open with the ease of someone used to doing this several times a shift. The identification inside looked legitimate. The problem was the photograph. The man in it was clean, groomed, and polished. He looked almost nothing like the rugged figure in the oversized coat and dusty boots sitting on the bench. Martin frowned before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Carlo?" he asked, suspicion now openly woven into his tone. "Why aren't you at a shelter?" Bud met his gaze, calm and unreadable. "I like fresh air," he said simply. "Is that against the law?" Albert shifted awkwardly and glanced at his partner. Lowering his voice, he murmured, "He's not doing anything illegal. We can't just push him out." "Maybe not," Martin muttered, jaw tightening. "But we can make it uncomfortable." For the first time, something flickered behind Bud's eyes. It was quick. Maybe irritation, maybe disappointment, maybe both. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He picked up the sandwich again and took another slow bite, chewing with a composure that only seemed to deepen Martin's frustration. The tension hanging over the scene began to pull the attention of people passing by. A few slowed their pace. Some glanced over and kept walking. One woman with a dog stopped entirely. "He's not bothering anybody," she called out, uncertainty in her voice, but enough courage to say it anyway. "Why are you harassing him?" Martin turned sharply toward her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. It's a public park," she fired back. "That means he has every right to sit there." Albert lifted a hand, trying to keep the peace. "Ma'am, we're doing our job. Please, keep moving." The woman hesitated. Her hand tightened around the leash as she looked from Bud on the bench to the officers standing over him. Then she shook her head, muttered something under her breath, and continued on her way. Bud watched her leave, and for just a second there was the faintest trace of amusement on his face. He brushed crumbs from his lap and set the sandwich down again. "Am I free to go?" he asked. His voice remained calm, but there was steel under it now. "You're not under arrest," Albert admitted, though the look Martin shot him suggested he hated hearing that said aloud. "But maybe you should find somewhere else to sit." Bud nodded once and slowly rose to his feet. As he stood, both officers seemed to notice for the first time just how big he actually was. It wasn't just height, it was presence. There was something massive and immovable about him. He adjusted the brim of his hat with easy, unhurried fingers. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low, steady, and just pointed enough to sting. Martin watched him walk away, the muscles in his face tightening. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" he muttered to Albert. "Like he was better than us." "Let it go," Albert replied with a tired shake of his head. "Not worth the paperwork." Bud walked at an unhurried pace, moving down the path as if he had nowhere urgent to be and no reason to rush. The pressure in the air began to loosen, but not entirely. Something remained. A quiet defiance. A challenge that had not been spoken aloud and yet had been heard all the same. Martin stood watching until Bud disappeared around the bend. His fingers flexed at his sides. "I don't trust him," he said after a beat. "Something's off." "You don't have to trust him," Albert replied. "You just have to leave him alone." Bud turned the corner with the paper bag still tucked under one arm, his stride as controlled as ever. Just before he vanished from view, however, the smallest knowing smile touched his mouth. This was far from over. Martin narrowed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong about that guy," he said, still staring at the now empty path as though forcing himself to remember every detail. "Drop it," Albert said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "He's gone. No harm done." "No harm yet," Martin answered immediately. "You saw the ID. It looked real, sure. But who carries a wallet like that, dressed like that? And why is he even in this park? It doesn't add up." Albert shrugged and turned back toward the cruiser. "Not our problem. We keep the peace. We're not detectives solving riddles." Martin said nothing, but his thoughts kept circling. The man had been too calm, too steady, too deliberate. Most people confronted by police showed fear, anger, or panic. This man had shown none of it. He had looked at them like he'd measured them in seconds and already decided exactly who they were. He walked like someone who had lived through worse and was unimpressed by uniforms. "He's hiding something," Martin muttered as he got back into the cruiser, jaw set hard. Albert let out a breath but didn't bother arguing. Experience had taught him not to waste energy trying to talk younger men out of instincts they mistook for certainty. Meanwhile, Bud had moved deeper into the park until he found a quieter spot away from most of the foot traffic. He sat on another bench beneath a spread of old oak trees, his movements slow and unhurried. The paper bag rested beside him again, untouched for now. He leaned back and tipped the hat slightly forward. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man enjoying the stillness of an ordinary afternoon. But there was something in the way he sat. Calm, yes. Relaxed, yes. But alert. Like a man waiting. It didn't take long for the peace to break. Two joggers came around the bend, their shoes crunching softly along the path. As they drew near, their conversation faded. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sleek fitness watch strapped to his wrist and a look of polite disapproval permanently fixed to his face, nudged the woman beside him and muttered something under his breath. She glanced at Bud, wary and stiffening. "Should we call someone?" the man asked quietly, though not so quietly that Bud couldn't hear. There was something about the large figure on the bench that made him uneasy. He looked out of place, and to people like that, out of place often meant dangerous. Bud barely reacted. He opened his eyes for a moment, looked in their direction, then let his gaze drift back toward the sky. His expression gave away nothing. His body remained loose and quiet, yet the silence between them thickened. The joggers exchanged a look and moved on faster than before, footsteps fading in a hurry. Then came a group of teenagers on bikes, loud and careless, weaving through the trees with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been properly challenged. One of them spotted Bud and slowed, a grin spreading over his face. "Check this guy out," he called, motioning for the others to circle back. "Hey man, you homeless or what?" Bud didn't answer. He looked at the boy with a detached calm that seemed to confuse him. Encouraged by the silence, the teen rolled a little closer. "What happened, old man? Lose everything betting on football?" His friends burst out laughing. One of them raised a phone and pointed it toward Bud like he was filming a joke for social media. "Come on, say something," he sneered. "Give us the tragic backstory." At last, Bud spoke, voice calm and unhurried. "You boys should keep moving," he said. "This isn't the place for games." The laughter weakened. Something shifted. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened them. But there was a weight in the way he said it that unsettled them. They hesitated, glancing at one another. Then the low hum of a police cruiser approaching made the decision for them. The car pulled up and the teens scattered fast, tires spitting dust as they shot off down the path. Martin stepped out first, his eyes sweeping the area before landing on Bud. "You again," he muttered as he walked over. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Bud stayed seated. "Did they pass a law against benches?" Martin's jaw tightened. "You've got a smart mouth." "Good thing I'm not trying to make friends," Bud replied. Albert joined them a moment later, looking tired already. "What's going on now?" he asked. "Why are we back here?" "I don't trust him," Martin said flatly. "He's up to something." "He's sitting on a bench," Albert said with a sigh. "Let it go." But Martin was already too far into it. He stepped forward, one hand resting near the baton on his hip. "What's in the bag?" Bud tilted his head slightly, eyes steady. "Lunch. Show me." Bud lifted the wrinkled paper bag and held it out. Martin peered in. Inside was exactly what Bud said. An apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. "You carrying anything else?" Martin pressed. "Anything you don't want us to find?" Bud set the bag down again with infinite patience. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. "But if you're hoping for trouble, I'm not your man." Albert shook his head. "Let's go," he told Martin. "We've got better things to do." Martin didn't move. The calm in front of him bothered him more than hostility would have. "You're awfully relaxed for someone getting this much attention," he said, dropping his voice lower. "Most people in your position would be nervous." Bud did not blink. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he said. "Should I be nervous?" Martin stepped closer. "I'm saying you act like you've got nothing to lose." Bud held his gaze. "Maybe that bothers you more than it should." A few feet away, Albert leaned against the cruiser with visible irritation. "Come on," he called. "He's doing nothing. Let it go." Martin ignored him. He studied Bud harder. The old coat, the heavy hands, the steady breathing, the maddening composure. "You've got an answer for everything," he muttered. "You think you're smarter than me. I'm not trying to prove anything," Bud replied. "I'm sitting on a bench." Martin took another step, closing the distance. "You think you're clever," he said. "You think you can sit there and make me look stupid." Bud finally lifted his face a little more, enough for the line of his jaw and part of his weathered expression to show beneath the hat. "I think," he said, voice still calm, "you're doing that by yourself." Albert straightened immediately and crossed between them. "Enough," he said firmly. "We're done here." "No, we're not," Martin snapped, frustration finally breaking the surface. "This guy is playing us. I can feel it." "Feel whatever you want," Albert shot back. "You've got nothing on him. Drop it." For a moment it looked like Martin might keep going. His face was flushed now, pride bruised and temper close to the edge. But at last he stepped back. "Fine," he muttered. "We go." Bud said nothing. He watched them walk back toward the cruiser. Yet when Martin reached the patrol car, he glanced over his shoulder. Bud was still looking at him. Just for a split second, something passed between them. No words. Just a silent challenge. Albert got in and started the engine, shaking his head. "You've got to let this go," he said. "It's not worth the headache." "It's not about the headache," Martin muttered, staring out the window as the city blurred past. "It's about respect. He acts like none of this can touch him." "He's just a guy in a park," Albert said. "We've got real work." But Martin was no longer listening. His thoughts churned. Who was this man? Why did he carry himself like someone untouched by fear? Why did it feel as if he were hiding something when no proof existed? Back on the bench, Bud watched the cruiser disappear around the bend. Then he reached calmly into the paper bag and took out what remained of his sandwich. As he unwrapped it, his eyes shifted toward a line of trees nearby. A man in a grey hoodie stood there watching. The figure stepped out carefully, stopping a few feet from the bench. He looked around first, making sure they were unobserved. "How's it looking?" he asked in a low voice. Bud took a bite of the sandwich and chewed slowly. "Exactly how I expected," he replied. "They're suspicious, but they still don't know anything." The man in the hoodie nodded. "You think they'll come back?" "They always come back," Bud said, the faintest smile passing over his lips. "Curiosity's a funny disease." The man hesitated. "You sure about this?" "You're pushing them hard." "That's the point," Bud answered. "I want to know how far they'll take it." A jogger slowed a few yards away to tie a shoe, glanced at them briefly, and moved on. The man in the hoodie shifted uneasily. "Just be careful. It won't go sideways," Bud said evenly, with a confidence that ended the discussion. "I know what I'm doing." The hooded man studied him for another second, then slipped back into the trees. Bud ate in silence for only a short while before he heard the engine again. The cruiser was back. He didn't move. He finished the last bite of his sandwich, posture easy and face unreadable. The now empty brown bag sat beside him. As soon as the car stopped, Martin was out of it and moving before the vehicle had even settled. Albert followed, irritation written plainly across his face. "You again," Martin said, voice edged with impatience. His eyes dropped to the paper bag and then rose again. "Haven't we already done this?" Bud lifted his head. "We have," he said. "I didn't realize sitting quietly was a repeat offense." "Don't get smart with me," Martin snapped, hand resting on his hip. You're still here, still suspicious. I don't know what your angle is, but I'm going to find out. Albert held up a hand. What are you doing? We already cleared him. He's up to something, Martin insisted. That's not law, Albert said, exhaustion returning to his voice. You don't get to harass someone because you have a bad feeling. Then why is he still here? Martin demanded. Why hasn't he moved on? Normal people don't sit around like this. Bud's gaze sharpened, though his tone stayed level. Normal people? He repeated. And what exactly does that mean? Martin stepped forward. It means people who aren't waiting around parks, trying to draw attention. Maybe I just like the scenery, Bud said. Or maybe I don't see why I should be chased out of a public place for no reason. Albert rubbed his temple. You're turning this into something it isn't, he told Martin. Drop it, Martin pointed toward Bud. If he's got nothing to hide, then he won't mind a few more questions. Bud inclined his head slightly. Go ahead. Why this park? Martin demanded. Why this bench? Bud shrugged. Didn't know benches required permits. What's your deal? Martin pressed. You're too calm, too deliberate. People don't sit like this unless they're planning something. Planning what? Bud asked mildly. A quiet afternoon? A nap? A picnic? Tell me the crime first, and I'll explain the motive. Albert stepped in again. That's enough. We've got nothing. Let's go. Martin ignored him and reached for his radio. Dispatch, Unit 12. Run a records check. Name, Carlo Pedisoli. ID provided earlier. Bud raised one eyebrow but said nothing. The radio crackled. Copy that. Unit 12. Stand by. Albert groaned softly. You're making this into something it isn't, he muttered. This is going to come back on us. Then if he's clean, he's clean. Martin shot back. Bud leaned back against the bench and folded his arms. Persistent, he said, sounding almost amused, almost flattering. Don't play games with me, Martin snapped. The radio crackled again. Unit 12. No records found under the name Carlo Pedisoli, matching the provided ID. Martin's grip on the radio tightened until his knuckles went pale. What do you mean, no records? Exactly what it sounds like, Dispatch replied. No matching file. Either the ID is false or the database has an error. Albert turned sharply toward Martin. Enough. We are not turning this into a witch hunt. Leave it. But Martin's suspicion only deepened. He's lying, he said, jabbing a finger toward Bud. That ID is fake. Bud remained steady, though the faintest suggestion of amusement brushed his features. If that's true, he said smoothly, why didn't you notice the first time? Martin opened his mouth, but Albert cut him off and physically pulled him back a step. We're done here. Let's go before you make this worse. Martin allowed himself to be dragged toward the cruiser, but he kept glaring over his shoulder. This isn't over, he muttered before yanking open the door. The cruiser pulled away again. Bud watched it go. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small device, smooth and black, that fit neatly in his palm. He turned it over once, and the corner of his mouth lifted. Everything was unfolding exactly the way he had expected. A few minutes later, the cruiser looped back into the lot yet again. Martin gripped the steering wheel so hard it seemed his hands might lock into place. I know something's wrong with this guy, he muttered. Plenty of people seem wrong at first glance, Albert said. Maybe the system just glitched. No, Martin replied. There's more to it. The way he talks, the way he moves. He's not random. He's playing us. Albert exhaled sharply. Playing us how? By sitting down and eating? Martin steered toward the trees. Sure enough, Bud was there, on the same worn bench. Hat tipped back slightly now, so a little more of his face showed. The empty paper bag had been folded and placed beside his leg. As the officers approached, Bud looked up, composed and almost amused. We're not done with you, Martin said. That ID doesn't exist. Bud arched an eyebrow. Maybe your system doesn't work. Don't get clever, Martin said. I know a fake when I see one. Albert stepped in before it could flare too fast. We're giving you a chance to be honest, he said. If there's something we need to know, say it now. Bud leaned back slightly, entirely at ease. And what exactly do you think I'm hiding? He asked. A secret identity, a criminal record, a plot to control the local bench industry. Albert pressed his fingers to his temple. Look, he said, frustration showing now. You're not helping yourself. If there's a reason you're here, say it. Otherwise, my partner is going to keep pushing. Bud's eyes settled on Martin. You already decided who I am, he said calmly. Nothing I say will change that. Martin moved in closer, fingers curling around the baton at his hip. You think you're smart, he said, low and tight. You think you can sit there acting like you're better than us? I don't think I'm better than anybody, Bud answered evenly. But I do think you've got something to prove. That landed hard. Martin's face darkened instantly. Before Albert could stop him, he stepped even closer, towering over Bud. You think this is funny? He demanded. You think you can make me look like a fool? Bud took a slow breath. I think, he said, you're handling that without my help. Albert grabbed Martin's arm and yanked him back. Enough, he said. We're not doing this. But Martin gestured sharply at Bud, anger breaking loose. He's hiding something. He's too calm. Nobody acts like this unless they're covering something up. Albert's patience frayed. Even if he is, we don't get to shake him down until we invent probable cause. Probable cause? Martin said, voice rising. How about fake ID? How about refusing to leave? It's a public park. Albert snapped back. He doesn't have to leave. Bud remained seated, alert despite his relaxed posture, taking in every word and every shift in tone. You're going to regret this, Martin muttered at last, pointing at him. Whatever you're up to, I'll figure it out. Bud tilted his head and let a faint smirk touch his face. I'm sure you'll try, he said. Best of luck. The words only fueled Martin's resentment. He stormed off toward the cruiser, shoulders tight with anger. Albert followed, moving slower, wearing the look of a man who already knew the day had gone too far. As the cruiser drove away once more, Martin stared ahead, thoughts racing. He's playing us, he said under his breath. Or maybe, Albert replied, you're reading too much into it. Martin did not answer. His mind was already building the next step. Whatever it took, he was going to uncover the truth about the man on that bench. Back in the park, Bud watched the taillights disappear and reached into his coat pocket once more. The same small device rested in his hand. He turned it over thoughtfully. The game was still in motion. The air shifted again when Martin returned to the park alone. Albert had finally had enough and refused to take part any further, calling it a pointless fixation. But Martin no longer saw it as fixation. To him, this was about control now. About winning. About forcing the truth into the shape he had already imagined. Bud remained seated exactly where he had been, steady as stone. His hat sat farther back now, exposing more of his lined face. There was a softness in the heaviness of his features, but his eyes were sharp enough to unsettle anyone who met them too long. You've got nerve, Martin muttered as he stopped a few feet away. Sitting here like you own the place. Bud looked up. It's a public park, he said. Nobody owns it. You know what I mean, Martin snapped. You've been playing with me all day. Tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it. The corners of Bud's mouth lifted slightly. You really want to know? Enough of the smart remarks, Martin growled. Let's see some real ID. No tricks this time. Bud reached into his coat slowly, deliberately. Martin tensed hard, hand ready at the baton, but Bud didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone. The polished screen caught the fading light as he held it up between them. Here's the thing, Bud said, voice suddenly carrying more weight than before. "I don't owe you proof, but since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." He tapped the screen a few times. A video began to play. Martin leaned in despite himself, brow furrowing. The footage showed him. Earlier that day. Standing over Bud. Posture aggressive. Voice sharp. Every word captured clearly. Every tone. Every jab. Every sneer. "What is this?" Martin barked, and for the first time his confidence cracked. "This," Bud replied, calm and unshaken, "is a live stream. It's been running all day." Martin stared. "Every conversation we've had," Bud continued, "every word you spoke, every choice you made, was broadcast in real time." The color drained from Martin's face. "What? What?" Bud stood. Now that he was upright and no longer trying to appear smaller, there was no hiding what he was. He towered over the younger officer with a presence that was not theatrical but absolute. He slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. "I'm not just Carlo Pedisoli," he said. Martin's lips parted, but no real words came out. Bud removed the hat completely. "I'm also Bud Spencer." Martin blinked, stunned. "What?" "I'm not joking," Bud said. "I wanted to see how men with authority treat the people they assume don't matter." The meaning hit all at once. The calm, the confidence, the way Bud had controlled every encounter without ever raising his voice. Martin finally found his own again. "You set me up." Bud shook his head once. "No. I gave you choices. What you did with them was yours." Martin's face flushed with anger and panic. "You had no right." "I had every right," Bud answered coolly. "You wear a badge. You're meant to serve the public. Instead, you decided to humiliate someone you believed was beneath you." "You can't use this," Martin stammered. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." Bud did not move. "It isn't entrapment. I didn't force you to say a single word. And if you'd like to argue the law, I assure you there are people who can explain it better than I need to." By then, the outside edge of the park had begun to fill. People gathered in clusters, phones already up, news vans pulled to the curb, brakes screeching. Reporters spilled out with cameras on their shoulders, speaking urgently into microphones as they rushed toward the scene. Martin looked around and saw it all at once. The crowd, the lenses, the red recording lights, the spectators whispering and pointing. It was no longer private. It was no longer controllable. "This isn't over," he snapped, though his voice shook. Bud's face remained unreadable. "It already is. The world is watching." Martin's chest rose and fell too quickly. Rage, humiliation, and disbelief churned through him. His eyes darted from camera to camera, to the phones, to Bud standing in front of him with impossible calm. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat. "Dressing up and playing games?" "This isn't about me," Bud said. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in power treat those they think have none." "Powerless?" Martin barked. "You're Bud Spencer, a legend." Bud gave the faintest lift of an eyebrow. "Exactly! And the moment you thought I was just another homeless man, you treated me like garbage. So what happens to the people who really can't fight back?" That landed on the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Murmurs swelled. Words like abuse, profiling, and corruption began to ripple through the onlookers. Albert arrived moments later, face pale, having followed the chaos from the cruiser but not expecting it to explode this far. He grabbed Martin's arm hard. "Stop talking," he hissed. "You're making it worse." "I'm not letting him get away with this," Martin shot back. But there was panic in him now. Albert's grip tightened. His eyes said what his mouth didn't need to. It was already done. The anger in Martin's face flickered and then gave way to something worse. Defeat. "You already did enough," Albert said quietly. "Don't bury yourself deeper." The crowd grew louder. Phones remained raised. Reporters spoke fast into live broadcasts, reaching millions. The collapse of Martin's authority was happening in full view. Bud turned slightly toward the cameras and the onlookers. When he spoke, the noise around him seemed to bend around the steadiness of his voice. "This isn't only about one officer," he said. "It's about a culture that allows people to treat others with contempt the moment they think those people are invisible. Accountability doesn't begin when someone gets caught. It begins with attitude." The crowd erupted in applause. Martin stood frozen, face burning. There would be no undoing this, no talking it back, no reclaiming control. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, but the words were swallowed by the noise. "Your job is to protect and serve," Bud said, eyes steady, "not to profile, intimidate, or abuse the power you've been given. If you can't carry that responsibility with dignity, then maybe you shouldn't carry it at all." Albert stepped forward again. "We need to leave, now." But before they could move, another voice cut cleanly through the chaos. "Officers, stand down." Heads turned. A woman in a sharp, tailored suit was striding toward them with the kind of controlled authority that made space open in front of her without anyone being told to move. Her presence shifted the energy immediately. The badge at her belt identified her as Captain Jane Monroe, Internal Affairs, NYPD. Martin went still. She looked at him once, cool and direct. "You've made a spectacular mess," she said. "I hope you're prepared for the consequences." "Ma'am, She raised one hand and shut him down instantly. "Save it. I've seen the footage, and judging by the crowd, so has everyone else." The people around them were no longer merely watching. They were openly jeering now, anger and disgust moving through them like current. Captain Monroe then turned toward Bud, and though she didn't soften much, there was a trace of respect in her tone. "Mr. Spencer," she said, "on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for what happened here today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I can assure you it will be addressed." Bud gave a slow nod. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen to the next person." She studied him for a moment, then turned back to Martin. "Badge and weapon," she ordered. Martin stared at her, stunned. "What?" Now, his hands began to shake. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," she said. "You are on administrative leave pending investigation, and that investigation will be thorough." Martin unfastened the badge with trembling fingers. Then the weapon. He handed both over, his face a mix of disbelief and humiliation. No one in the crowd had any pity left for him. Relief and vindication surged through them in cheers. As Martin was led away, shoulders heavy and eyes hollow, Bud faced the cameras one last time. "This is not the end," he said. "If people want real change, then accountability has to be daily, not occasional. Not just when there's a camera. Every day." The crowd roared its agreement. Martin, stripped of authority, disappeared through a sea of people, while news crews kept filming the bench that had become the center of the day's reckoning. Bud stood near the fountain, hands in the pockets of his old coat, looking as if this had all been only another long afternoon. Captain Monroe returned to him once more, composed but serious. "Mr. Spencer," she said, choosing each word carefully, "I want to personally assure you this will be fully investigated. This department does not tolerate conduct like this." Bud nodded, though there was no satisfaction in his expression. "I hope that's true," he said, "because this was never only about one officer. It's about the culture that makes men like that think they can act without consequence." She hesitated, the weight of that landing plainly on her. "I understand," she said at last, "and I'll make sure your concerns are heard." As she walked away, Bud turned back toward the bench, a faint trace of a smile brushing the corner of his mouth. He sat down again and took out his phone. Comments were pouring into the live stream faster than the screen could comfortably hold them. Thousands upon thousands. Shock, outrage, support, testimony, recognition. A nation reacting in real time. "This is why accountability matters," one person wrote. "Bud Spencer just exposed something huge," wrote another. "This is bigger than one cop," someone else said. Bud's expression softened slightly as he typed a short response. Change starts with awareness. Keep your eyes open. From the edge of the crowd, an elderly woman slowly approached. Her steps were hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she had the right to interrupt. I didn't know who you were, she admitted, voice trembling faintly. But what you did, it was brave. You didn't have to do this. Bud looked up at her, and the hardness in him eased into something gentler. Sometimes the only way to understand a problem is to live close enough to feel it, he said. And sometimes the only way to change it is to drag it into the light. Her eyes glistened. Then thank you, she said, for standing up for people who can't. Bud gave a small nod and watched her disappear into the slowly thinning crowd. Nearby, officers still on scene spoke quietly with superiors, posture stiff with discomfort. Martin, now stripped of both badge and gun, sat in the back of another cruiser bent forward with his head in his hands. Whether he knew it yet or not, much of his life had just cracked apart under the weight of his own choices. Across the way, Captain Munro stood with investigators reviewing the live-stream footage frame by frame. Every second mattered now. Every word, every pause, every choice. For Bud, though, this had never been about one man, one confrontation, or one afternoon. It was larger than that. And he had no intention of letting the momentum die. The sun had begun to sink, drawing long shadows across the quieter corners of the park. Bud rolled one shoulder, easing the stiffness from it, when a sleek black SUV glided to the curb. A young assistant stepped out and opened the rear door. Ready to go, sir? Bud glanced toward the car, then back across the park. Not yet. He returned to the bench where everything had begun, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a pen and a scrap of paper. With quick, deliberate strokes, he wrote something down, folded it, and tucked it beneath one of the worn wooden slats. The assistant said nothing, though the curiosity was obvious. Bud finally walked toward the SUV. Before stepping inside, he turned for one last look at the crowd, the officers, the cameras, and the bench itself, which had somehow become a symbol before the day was even over. This was never just about me, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. It was about making sure everybody gets treated like they belong. Then he climbed in. As the SUV pulled away, the note he had hidden under the bench fluttered gently in the evening air. It read, "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Even after the crowd began to disperse, the conversation did not die. People lingered in little groups, talking in low but intense voices about everything they had just seen. They spoke about authority, about abuse, about bias, and about the courage of a man who had used nothing more than a bench and a disguise to expose the truth. The day would live on well beyond the headlines. It would stay with the people who had stood there and watched it unfold with their own eyes. And for Bud Spencer, it was only the beginning. One bench, one officer, one moment. But every real movement starts with something small enough to be dismissed, right before it becomes impossible to ignore. Reclining in the SUV, Bud scrolled through the flood of incoming messages. There was no doubt in his mind now. The fire had already been lit. The lesson was simple and heavy at the same time. Power, whether it comes through status, wealth, or uniform, carries responsibility. Change does not happen until people are willing to hold themselves and each other accountable. Only then can dignity stop being a privilege and become what it should have been all along, a right. As news of Bud Spencer's social experiment spread, the footage took on a life far beyond the park. It exploded across social media, dominated national headlines, and fueled arguments in living rooms, on television panels, and in community meetings. Some praised Bud for forcing a spotlight onto a systemic issue. Others questioned the ethics of staging something like this in the first place. But whatever side people took, one thing became undeniable. The conversation about bias, accountability, and law enforcement had been reopened in a way nobody could ignore. Back in the park, normal life slowly returned. But the bench where Bud had sat became a landmark of its own. people came to photograph it. Some left notes. Others sat there quietly for a while, reading the message he had tucked beneath the slats. Your story matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Those words reached people who knew exactly what it meant to be overlooked, dismissed, or judged before they spoke. For them, it wasn't just a sentence. It was recognition. For Officer Martin, the consequences came fast and hard. Without badge or weapon, he found himself at the center of an investigation, watched by the public and his own department alike. His behavior was condemned not only outside the force, but within it. Albert, though spared formal punishment, carried something heavier than discipline. The knowledge of how quickly unchecked bias could turn ugly, while people around it told themselves it was no big deal. The day changed him. It left him determined to do better and to make sure no one under his watch ever repeated what he had witnessed. As for Bud, he stepped back into public view with renewed purpose. Days later, standing before a sea of cameras in Times Square, he addressed the public again. "This was never about me," he said. "It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves, to our institutions, to the way we decide who deserves respect. The only question now is what we do after we've seen the reflection." What a story. What a journey. Because in the end, this was never only about a man in worn-out clothes on a bench. It was about power, perception, and the way people get treated the moment assumptions take over. Bud Spencer didn't need rage. He didn't need threats. He barely needed words. His presence alone forced a system to reveal itself. And that was what made the whole thing so powerful. One of the clearest lessons in all of this was judgment. Officer Martin saw an oversized man in old clothes and decided immediately that he was the problem. But the real problem was the bias he brought with him. He assumed authority, gave him the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. And if we're honest, that kind of thinking shows up in the real world far more often than people like to admit. Then there was dignity. Bud never lost control. He never exploded. He never let anyone strip him of his self-respect, no matter how hard they tried. That was what made him untouchable in the end. Real power isn't a badge, a weapon, or a title. It's the ability to hold your ground without surrendering your humanity. And of course, accountability. The truth always surfaces eventually. Martin believed authority protected him, but the record, the evidence, the truth itself proved stronger than the power he thought he held. That is the reminder here. People must hold themselves and one another accountable, especially when power enters the room. So what do you think? What moment hit you the hardest? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Until next time, take care, stay aware, and remember, every person carries a story that matters.